Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the multiplayer open beta for the PC version of Call of Duty World War II. This is the upcoming first-person shooter and latest game in the Call of Duty series, developed by Sledgehammer Games and published by Activision, and it's going to be coming out in November of this year. Now supposedly this is the kind of Call of Duty that, I put extreme air quotes on this, everyone has been begging for years. You see so many people complaining about how the last several games weren't boots on the ground and weren't World War II. Well, before we get into the actual assessment of the beta itself, I want to mention something about this whole idea of, we want boots on the ground in World War II. Okay, boots on the ground, I can understand. The last several Call of Duty games were starting to get a bit stale with their supposed advanced movement systems that really weren't all that great. It was pretty painfully obvious that the Call of Duty formula just doesn't work all that well when you introduce movement systems like that, and that's something that's better left to games like Titanfall, for example, where they actually know how to handle it better. But then there's the second part, the whole, everyone wants World War II. I'm wondering who this everyone people speak of is, because I certainly don't know who it is. There have been 7 Call of Duty games set in World War II already. That is not counting World War II. Counting World War II, we now have 8 Call of Duty games set in World War II. On top of that, we have had 12 games in the Medal of Honor series that are all World War II as well. Between 2 series, starting in 1999 for Medal of Honor and 2003 for Call of Duty, we have had about 20 World War II first-person shooters. At this point, pretty much everything you could possibly think of has been done as far as World War II goes. The only things that haven't been done are allowing you to play as the Axis powers, which you know damn well is never going to happen because that would generate a crap ton of controversy, and we can't have that these days. So to all of you out there who were bitching about how Call of Duty is the same every year and they should go back to World War II, I hope you're proud of yourself now that you've managed to get yet another f***ing World War II first-person shooter out there that's inevitably doing the same f***ing thing that's been done for the past 20 years. Now then, mini rant out of the way, let's go ahead and actually talk about the game in question. Call of Duty World War II's PC open beta is only for the multiplayer component, and it only has some functionality enabled. The so-called headquarters mode, which is the sort of social environment that they are touting for this thing, is not available in the open beta. Instead, it only allows the basic matchmaking for Team Deathmatch, Hardpoint, Domination, the War mode, and Mosh Pit. All of these modes are 6v6, and with the exception of the War game mode, all of them have access to 3 maps. The War mode has access to its own specific map, which I will talk about later. There are a decent selection of guns and equipment on offer, as well as a decent selection of the available perks, so to speak, as well as all of the divisions being available. There are also a handful of cosmetic customization options that I'll mention later on as well, but suffice to say, that's a general overview of what you get if you play the open beta of Call of Duty World War II. Now before I start delving into that actual content, let me first mention the visuals. They're alright. I mean, they're pretty average for the current gen of consoles, and when you bring it onto PC, you do get a few more advanced options that make it look a bit better than the console versions, but it's really not all that noticeable, and what you end up with is just a decent looking game as far as solid modeling, decent enough texture work, some pretty decent particle effects, nothing that's really going to blow your mind, but it certainly doesn't look bad by any stretch of the imagination. That said, they are using the same old reload animation for the MP44 that they've been using for many, many years now. It's the same one that was featured in Call of Duty 4, but very slightly tweaked. It's kinda lazy, actually, especially considering the lack of animation reuse across the board for pretty much everything else. But still, that animation looks fine. It's just that if you've played previous Call of Duty games that featured the MP44 in some form, well, you're gonna notice it. If you've played previous Call of Duty games, you also know what to expect from the sound design as well. The gun and explosion sounds are relatively weak, although they're not as weak as they could be, so it is appreciated that they're not all pea shooters. But they really don't have much punch to them either, and it ends up making them less satisfying than other guns and other shooters to use. I have said it many, many times before, and I will probably keep saying it many, many times hence, but the Call of Duty series really needs to rework the sound design to make the gun and explosion sounds not sound wimpy. This is something that has absolutely plagued it for many, many years now, and it shows no signs of stopping, which makes it more depressing. At least the voice acting helps to bring things up, because generally speaking it's rather well done. All of the characters have their lines voiced relatively well, at least as far as the battle chatter in the online mode goes. Although I do have to admit, it is pretty funny that they included female soldiers in this for some utterly baffling reason, and yet they don't actually differentiate between them in the multiplayer component. All of the soldiers just end up referencing each other as he, no matter which gender they actually are. So that's a bit of an amusing oversight there, but beyond the voice acting and the sound effects, there's also the music, which is painfully generic World War II TV show or movie music. If you've seen the likes of Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers or The Pacific or any number of other World War II based movies or TV shows, then you've heard music almost exactly like what you hear in Call of Duty World War II. And while it's not outright bad music, it is extremely bland, and what you end up with is just this orchestral score that leaves you going, oh, great, another generic World War II soundtrack. So now that we've got the discussion of the presentation out of the way, let's go ahead and actually delve into the gameplay here, because there's no story in the multiplayer component. So the first thing the game has you do is select one of the divisions to play around with. These are basically the classes of the game. Each of them has their own specific special ability, and they all gradually level up over time to give you more and more bonuses. So the divisions are as follows. Infantry, which gives you a bayonet for your rifles, and it doesn't matter which rifle you're using as long as it is classified as a rifle, you got a bayonet on it, which then allows you to do a bayonet charge, which is if you're sprinting and you press the melee button, then you instantly kill whatever enemy you hit with that. Otherwise, it takes 2 melee hits to drop an enemy. The other divisions are as follows. Airborne, which allows you to attach and detach a suppressor to any submachine gun. Armored, which gives you a bipod so you can mount any light machine gun. Mountain, which allows you to block out the exterior areas of the scope when you're aiming down the sights of a sniper rifle, and also gives you some pretty noticeable aim assist. And Expeditionary, which gives you 4 incendiary shells to use with your shotguns. Whenever you select a division, it also comes with something called a division training, which is an additional sort of perk that gives you different bonuses. So for example, with the infantry one, you get a perk that also allows you to put multiple attachments on your primary weapon. Whereas with the armored, then you get one that allows you to select a launcher as a secondary weapon. This is intended to make each division have its own specific playstyle, but you can also further customize those with the basic trainings, which are basically just perks. For example, the Forage basic training is just the scavenger perk from previous Call of Duty games. So they've got the perks still in there, but now they're under the name basic training or division training. And something you notice right off the bat is that you only get 1 basic training per division. So when you set up your class, you have your division and that associated skill that goes along with it. For example, let's just say the airborne, you get the suppressor, and you also get the division training that comes with it, and then you get 1 slot for your basic training. So you really only get to choose 1 perk when you actually set up your class. And that's when something comes into very sharp focus. The amount of class and weapon customization that is in Call of Duty World War II is actually less than that of Call of Duty 4. Now you may think immediately, oh, well that obviously means that they've balanced everything out a lot better and now all of the classes are on the same playing field. To which I have to say, oh you poor naive thing. They have completely f***ed the balancing of this game. Submachine guns and the associated airborne division completely dominate the gameplay. Almost everyone is running around with submachine guns and not much more than that. If they're not running around with a submachine gun, then they're probably running around with a sniper rifle, because quickscoping has returned, and now it's pretty much back to the Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 levels, which were atrocious. Light machine guns are practically useless in this game, and when you go over to rifles, they are of very limited use, because there are 2 classes of weapons that simply do what they do better. Either the close-range combat is completely dominated by submachine guns, or the long-range combat is completely dominated by sniper rifles. So anyone selecting a rifle or a light machine gun is pretty much deliberately making themselves weaker compared to everyone else. Now you may be noticing, wait a minute DW, you haven't mentioned shotguns. Well, shotguns are hugely dependent on 2 factors. First off, is the map really cramped? If so, then a shotgun might be useful. Second, have you run out of incendiary shells yet? If not, then guess what? You've got 4 pretty much insta-gib shots right at your disposal. If you're out of the shells, on the other hand, then, well, you better be aiming really well with that thing, and you better be really close, otherwise you're probably not going to win that gunfight. Oh, and under no circumstances use the Luftwaffe drilling, because that thing is practically useless when you actually get down to it. I only used it because I wanted to mess around with the rifle bullet configuration that you can get when you level that weapon up to the max. And as it turns out, the rifle bullet configuration really isn't worth it, although it is kind of amusing that they did stick it in the game to begin with. So the point there is that if you're using a shotgun, then just use the 1897 trench gun, because if you're using anything else, then it makes the incendiary shells considerably less effective, and obviously what you want is to get a good center mass hit with the incendiary shells to get your insta-gib. Now I'm sure some of you probably already had a sudden muscle spasm when I said level that weapon up to the max, because that was something that has absolutely plagued the Call of Duty series for the past several entries. Well, guess what? Weapon leveling is back in full force. You level up your weapon by using it, and as you level it up, you unlock new attachments. This is on top of having all of the weapons unlock at set ranks, so it's much like in previous Call of Duty games where people who have played longer are just going to have access to better guns, period. This also has the side effect of, well, did you want a certain type of gun? Well, too bad, you're going to have to rank up to use it. Let's just say you want a Colt 45. Gotta be rank 25 to unlock that. Oh, and on top of being rank 25, you have to spend an unlock token to get it. To this day, it utterly baffles me why they include rank-based unlocks and unlock tokens. It should be one or the other, preferably just the unlock tokens. Because if it's only the unlock tokens, then everybody's pretty much on a relatively even playing field. You can get whatever you want at any time as long as you have unlock tokens for it. Whereas, if it's like in the previous Call of Duty games where you have to rank up to unlock stuff, well, people who've played longer just have objective advantages over new players. And no, it's not simply knowing the maps better or getting good. It's a matter of they just have better gear than the new players do. So as if it weren't bad enough that the game is inherently imbalanced from the start and has both the idiotic rank-based unlock system for new equipment and new guns, as well as the weapon leveling system that is equally idiotic for getting attachments, well, they also managed to completely butcher any and all personalization options that you could have had. Want to put camos on your guns? You can't. Want to put different finishes on your guns? You can't. Want to put different character customization options, maybe for different equipment that is showing up on your character model? Well, you get the option between basically 2 uniforms, and that's pretty much it. And if you want any more customization options than that, well, you can choose their face, although the faces are all presets, and there's only really a handful of them, and there's either male or female. Beyond that, the only personalization you can get is to choose your emblem and your calling card. That's it! There is nothing else to personalize in this game. It's a f***ing joke. Hell, even the score streak options are pretty limited, and most of the score streaks actually pretty much suck. Of course, that's assuming you even can stay alive long enough to get those score streaks, because like in pretty much all of the Call of Duty games, they have an absolutely terrible spawn system with absolutely terrible maps. Meaning the amount of deaths you have from enemies that spawned behind you or managed to get to the side of you because the map design is such a clusterfuck is off the charts. In fact, that seems to be the #1 criticism leveled at Call of Duty World War II, that the maps are terrible. Well, that's certainly a very major component of it, sure, but it's not the only thing. Although the game did have a really, really nasty habit of throwing me on the Aachen map, which is actually the worst map in the entire beta. To say that was extremely frustrating is an understatement. But you know what the most frustrating experience in this game was? The game mode simply entitled War. This is the mode where the defending team has to hold their position and prevent the attacking team from completing whatever objective it has assigned to it. This could be something along the lines of simply capture a point, or escort a tank to a certain location, or build a bridge or something along those lines. If the attacking team manages to complete all of its objectives and force the defenders back to their very last defensive position and then manage to complete their objective on that, they win the match. If the defenders manage to stop them at any point and let the timer run out, then the defenders win. Now you may be thinking, oh, well, that actually sounds like a pretty good idea. It actually does sound like a pretty good idea. I've seen that kind of thing done before in the likes of, say, Wolfenstein Enemy Territory. It actually works really well in that game. Doesn't work in Call of Duty because people who play Call of Duty do not work as a team. Now, your average Call of Duty player is going to run around like a headless chicken, get mowed down by people who actually know what they're doing, and then start screaming that everyone is cheating because they are losing and there's no evidence to support anybody else cheating. That, or they're just going to sit in a corner and wait for people to run past so they can mow them down with incredible ease. All your average Call of Duty player cares about is padding their KD ratio. They don't want to work as a team. They don't care. And in a game mode as team-oriented as the war game mode of Call of Duty World War II, well, that means that the mode is effectively forfeit. I mean, think about it. If you've played any Call of Duty game, what is the only mode you are guaranteed to get a game in all of the time? It's Team Deathmatch. All of the objective-based modes are usually graveyards. This ultimately means that while well-intentioned, the war game mode in Call of Duty World War II just doesn't work for the Call of Duty formula. It is too team-oriented for the extremely individualistic nature of Call of Duty. You can make something like Hardpoint or Domination work because the objectives are pretty simple and people can still run around like headless chickens and at least have some degree of effect. But a mode as teamwork-oriented as the war game mode is just going to be a disaster, and as it turns out, it was a disaster. I saw so many matches where the outcome was decided on the very first objective. If the attacking team manages to take that first objective, it's pretty much over, because you know that that attacking team actually has some degree of teamwork and the defending team does not. And quite frankly, it is not enjoyable to play a mode where the outcome of the match is decided within the first about 3 minutes of gameplay. Now, your mileage may vary. You may get insanely lucky with the matchmaking and manage to find two teams that actually can work well together and you have some decent back and forth. But it really does require a ridiculous amount of luck for that. So when you exclude the new game mode, which is already pretty much a bust, what do you have? Well, you have a Call of Duty game in all of the core gameplay aspects, still aim down sights, 2-weapon limit, you run around, you shoot stuff, you have a melee button you can hit, although in this one it takes 2 melee hits to bring down an enemy as opposed to 1 in some of the previous ones. It's got regenerating health, it's got a slot for you to use your various equipment, which is just going to be grenades in this thing, and for most classes you only have 1 of those slots. For the Expeditionary class you have 2 of those slots. But you have to unlock that by leveling up the division to a certain point. Yep, they put in division levels on top of weapon levels and your basic character levels, as if the game wasn't unbalanced enough, right? But here's the thing, if you've played a Call of Duty game since Call of Duty 4, then you've pretty much played this, only this is actually worse than everything that came between Call of Duty 4 and now. They've completely gutted the character and weapon customization options that were in the previous games. They've gutted the class customization options. They continue to use features like the weapon leveling and the rank-based unlocks that keep the game unbalanced right from the start. And on top of all of that, they force you to use matchmaking, again, instead of providing a server browser. And if the game does use dedicated servers, it's awfully laggy. I'm sure you've noticed some of that throughout this video, where you'll shoot and then it'll take a moment for the shot to actually connect. So if nothing else, they've never fixed netcode problems that have been in this series for a very long time now. And then on top of all of that, they pretty much make a mockery of World War II. Don't get me wrong, women did serve in World War II, but very, very few of them actually saw combat. The ones that did see combat the most are Russian snipers. Most women who served during World War II were in auxiliary roles, so they were either staffing offices or they were nurses or something like that. Well away from the front line. Now I get that it's a video game and they can just kind of do whatever the hell they want with it, but it is still a bit weird that they did decide to include female characters in the multiplayer component. But then they have other idiotic things like reflex sights for your guns that are straight up red dot sights without the red dot. Instead, it's a yellow circle and a dot. They aren't even trying to hide it at this point. I mean, at least in World at War, they had the excuse of, well, it's an aperture sight with a black crosshair painted on it. In this game, they function 100% exactly like a red dot sight in any of the other Call of Duty games that are more modern. They've got weapon choices that do not make any remote bit of sense being in that particular theater of war. For example, the Japanese Type 100 submachine gun. I'd like to remind you that this game takes place exclusively in the European theater. What the hell is a Japanese submachine gun doing there? And from what I can tell, it's the only weapon from the Pacific Theater that's actually showcased in this game, so it's actually kind of baffling that they put it in this thing. But you know what? I will give Sledgehammer Games this. At least they didn't make as much of a mockery out of World War II as DICE did when they made Battlefield 1. I mean, don't get me wrong, they still treat World War II like a total playground and don't treat it with any sort of respect for the multiplayer component. But at least the game doesn't have you using experimental weapons that never made it past the prototype stage, and doesn't have infantrymen running around with weapons that they would never actually have used during combat. But the real test of whether or not they truly make a mockery out of World War II is going to be when the single-player campaign comes around. Because the multiplayer is so gamified in the Call of Duty series and so ridiculously casual, arcadey nonsense that it is pretty easy to just compartmentalize it, put it in its own little vacuum and say, okay, well, it's just not trying to be realistic, it's a goofy arcade game. But you really still can't ignore what it does, and if they really screw up the single-player campaign, then it would be especially insulting. But I think the real problem with it is that they're trying to build this game as some sort of homage to World War II, some sort of heartfelt depiction of what World War II must have been like for the people who experienced it. Well, if the multiplayer is any indication, then you had plenty of women in military uniforms running around mowing down Nazis with machine guns and burning them alive with flamethrowers. But I digress. At least in its current state as of the PC open beta, the multiplayer component of Call of Duty World War II is complete garbage. Mechanically, it's a mess, it's got netcode problems, and on top of all of that, it's got less content in it than the past 10 years worth of Call of Duty games. Everything about the multiplayer gameplay of Call of Duty World War II feels not like a return to form, but instead just like a blatant regression. Like they're just being lazy with it, not trying to actually innovate or try anything different. Frankly, as far as the Call of Duty series goes, I'd rather just play Call of Duty World at War. At least it had some degree of personality compared to this. Call of Duty World War II, on the other hand, is just bland and uninspired. And unless the single-player campaign really fixes things up, I can't foresee this thing being anything worth getting at all. But ultimately, we'll just have to wait and see how it goes. This is, after all, just an open beta of the multiplayer component only, and it's not even the full functionality of the multiplayer component. So we'll just see what happens when the full game rolls around. I honestly don't know when I'm going to take a look at the full game. Obviously it releases in November, but I'm not going to pick it up at full price, that's for sure. I'm not even going to pick it up at half price. I'm probably not even going to pick this thing up until it's about $10 or less. I am just that sick of World War II first-person shooters. And frankly, there's other stuff I'm working on that is infinitely more interesting than Call of Duty World War II could ever hope to be. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you all in later videos.